Okay, yes. Good evening, brothers and sisters. It's time to get started. So let's start by taking refuge and generating bodhicitta for immeasurables and short mandala offering prayers together. First time in English, second time Vietnamese, and third time in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Từ nay cho đến ngày giác ngộ, con xin nguyện quay về nương tựa nơi Phật, Pháp và Tăng, hội chúng tối thượng, bằng sự thực hành bố thí và các hạnh tuyệt hảo ba la mật khác. Nguyện con sẽ thành Phật để làm lợi lạc cho tất cả chúng sinh. Sangye cho tăng cho ghê cho nam lao, chẳng cho ba điều na ni kiếp su chi, đã ghê chi số ghê bê số nam ghê, rô ha bê chi sang ghê rô ba số. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh có được hạnh phúc và nhân của hạnh phúc. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh thoát khỏi khổ đau và nhân của khổ đau. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh không xa lìa an lạc mà thoát khỏi khổ đau. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh an trụ trong tâm bình đẳng, không bám luyến bằng hữu, không sân hận kẻ thù. Xem trên tam chế để hoa tăng, để quay chú tăng, đền bà chú trì. Xem trên tam chế đủ nghèo tăng, đủ nghèo trì chú tăng, đủ hoa chú trì. Xem trên tam chế đủ nghèo mây bê, để hoa tăng mây đều hoa chú trì. Xem trên tam chế ni vinh cha bằng ni tăng đều quay, tăng nam lại bà chú trì. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as the Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Mặt đất này được trang nghiêm với dầu thơm và trải đầy hoa. Tô điểm với núi Tu Di, tứ đại bộ châu, mặt trời và mặt trăng. Con tưởng tượng nơi đây là cõi Phật và xin cúng dường. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh được an hưởng cõi tịnh độ này. Sa di vô kỳ chớp sinh mang thâu trang, rì pháp lên dê ni đê ngàn hoa đi, sang ghê sinh tu ni lê hoa yi, rớp cưng làm đa xuyên la châu phai sông. Idam Guru Dhana Mandala Khan Viriya Daya Mi.
What did I go? 어디가 최종가 같이 배송해라. 단주니가 셀라 롱메바. 단주니가 다 그지는 마부셔서라. 달와게 최초발라 달와. 단둘라서 버튼들 때는 최초발 달기 말와. 콤기 말와. Tension didn't never shinduka, Marmara Casa. Oh, Casa. Tension didn't never shinduka, you was not remember. It's a long person, there's some can the time Johnny said. And that's a bit of my time to get it. Namdang in June never situ. Namdang in June never situ, Sarah. Namdang in June never situ. Tendret and Yeshi Tamelas. Sila Kambai and Lucian of goodness since Tomang in Juse Sarah. Namdang in June never. You will see so yes. Kirava? It is one. Oh, you be a question. Sure. Namdang in June never see so yes. Matter. You matter. You curse. Let him be quite on your say. Chilamana said, just when you get it on them, and that I seen it. Condensibit and meditation, talk about attended to it. And the museum is my finish. Then Junior got still a long meba, didn't. Then Junior got still a long mebasa. Oh, Tawajet and Javachu saw a million days. She don't near Kawarese. Karasniti Kudish into two Kawasoda. And this in the near Kawasada. Then Junior gas. Make a chubung with children song with what? The way you sing condition at Sawapa. And the lodger in at the Chimbata. And the soul of Sabatezo. Zebu Yaputun at the Sava Comgodoa. And it's in the Sam Godoa and it's Shirabla Sobat in the local yard. Juma, which is Sokoda, Madoya Mudoa. Or this or that. Then Junior gas. It's such a win, but the sugar so million Mara Source Kayomara. Milady Kamaras cousin Dosa Pechana. Benjamin John Dosa Rasana, Comer Dacin Jota, Shivchesa, Semdesura, Milady Das, the Dutch and Butuve with the Matuba, Trolachina Kege, Noyo Mares, the Maduris Oda. The Duco, Tanzania, or the Sassin Bodese, Tanda Dembashi is a Ishingin Nobu. Can you Bumbule Lavores Oda? Ishingin Nobu said this someone saw them the Congo Dupior, Shima Penzel Kayungumar. Tenju de Shima Penzel and Dr. Vedua, this on that. Tenju de never seen to pass. Give it to do to what Jubala, Marmer. Nedi Shaji Tunda. Tenju got still a long mebas. Still a long mebas, the Yudum Bushidaki Teo Mara. Tenju got still a long meba. Yila Combe said the Nanshan Dosera. Oh, Tenit Tenju with under Milut of the day, they start in Borese. Said they should have removed egg Omara. Kazetana Lochi Kuchucha Series. Tina Nangarazu Mansha to Loma Kashin Rosara. Sata Shidake Omara. That they should say about the Tendeke Omara, Tadokas, Tendeke Omara. Tension you got still a long mebas. Yila Gombe said the Nanshan Dose. This somebody about again. And it said the Kanjalva, Shenja Shushibushora. Oh, the baby is Gora. Tension you got still a long meba. Yila something. Oh, this you lam Natamba.
So here, as the great master de la Tsongkhapa has said, there are a few verses here, but we'll stick with the one that we're trying to get to, which basically says that by cultivating in mind that this human life is so hard to find, yet has no time to spare, preoccupations with this life will cease. So here, this is following this other verse by de la Tsongkhapa, where he says that without pure renunciation, there is no means to pacify the yearning for the joys and fruits of samsaric ocean. As craving for existence chains us thoroughly, at first search for a true renunciation. So here, as we've previously discussed many times, the life that we have right now with the kind of freedoms from those 8 states lacking freedom and the 10 endowments, having met with the Buddha's teachings and so forth, this is something that is very precious and rare. It's very difficult to find. And as long as we are kind of lacking a recognition of the preciousness of this human life and how it won't remain, we will get caught up in the things of samsara. We won't have a kind of renunciation. So here we should recognize that this life, with all of its freedoms, with all of the opportunities that we have, is very difficult to find because its causes are difficult to create. So in order to get this kind of a life as a human being, we have to have protected ethics, abandoned the 10 non-virtues and so forth. To be able to have enough, say, to sustain ourselves, enough material wealth, we need to have practiced generosity. To have a sort of beautiful form or a nice form, we need to have practiced patience. And so in this way, then we need to have all of these trainings have come together to ripen in this kind of a human rebirth. And we need to view this as precious. Like, it is more precious than, say, hundreds of thousands of wish-fulfilling jewels. Because again, although those wish-fulfilling jewels might be able to give us something valuable for just this life, they can do nothing beyond this life. But yet it's the case that usually, like if we say lose some money in business or have some sort of a loss, we're really despondent over that. We get upset and depressed over that. But if we waste time of this life, we don't have that same feeling. And it's really because we're lacking a recognition of the great value of this life. And this follows by saying that there is no time to spare. This life that we have right now will not remain for long. Again, by recognizing this value, we see that what we have is something very precious, but we can't guarantee that it will be here. I mean, maybe we'll live 100 years, maybe we'll only live 50 years. Most of us have already passed a good number of years, and there's no certainty, sort of the order that we will die, when we will die, how we will die. So here, this is something that when we contemplate on this, when we really begin to recognize the value of the life that we have, and that it is not permanent, that it won't remain for long, but is something that we need to take advantage of while we can, this is what will eliminate the kind of preoccupations or craving for the things of this life. We will see that this life is something that we have to leave behind, and we'll have to pass into a future life. So we won't become as preoccupied with that kind of craving for the affairs of this life. So again, by cultivating in mind, by habituating ourselves to the fact that this human life is so difficult to find, yet has no time to spare, it won't remain, the preoccupations with this life will cease.
Làm thế nào để từ bỏ, để chỉ mưu toan là lo toan tính trong cuộc sống đời này? Tại vì cái thân này rất là quý báu, nhưng cái mạng sống nó không có lâu dài. Cho nên tâm thường nghĩ như vậy, để từ bỏ chỉ mưu toan lo lắng trong cái cuộc sống đời này.
Oya, na tanda ko ngara zo tindo wa. Tu ta tu tenge sore chimado. Soas ke yo marwa. Tu ta tu tenge sore samle tone ya chiwara. 다음에 시지 밀리토 되듯이 아우 개침부야 보시기 다른 토벤에서 삼로게요 말와 지만리 되듯이 일단 밀리디 깨게 말에 삼탄데 강에데 주는 게 깨게 정문도 삼자 tindetendegra o di samultangio masura tenjo mele de pesa chimburese ke chimburese tingara zo tandu to samultane ne akura samluke yo marwa shandake namje samultane chi longdo vinel samultane ke yo marwa o di samulde me sogora se tenjo nyegas shandal te so mele de pesa chimburde asti yane yandu tengure songora c'est le long mais c'est tout à tout tengue que semble sur le chorwa dil tengue mato me long dagaran de mato jine chima dre semble que korgu maro gaje tangzi chendra o di semble de mari shira long ge yo marda se mida pare se tenje ni ga chela long me bas o ye ti so da ya ti chili yang ja chila.
So right now, other than sort of thinking that we will remain forever, we do the things that we do with this kind of attitude of thinking, oh, I'll be here for a long time. And so here, this is really, we don't recognize our own impermanence, and nor often do we recognize the kind of value of the life that we have. Like some little thing goes wrong and we think like, oh, this isn't so great, or I don't really like this. And we don't actually appreciate the kind of value of the preciousness of the life that we have right now. Like if we look at animals, we can see how animals can't really think beyond just fulfilling their basic needs. They don't have the kind of intellect or reasoning. They aren't able to distinguish between what they should and shouldn't do. And so we need to recall our own kind of the value of our life again and again, really to get a feeling of that. And also, we need to think about death and impermanence. We grasp at permanence, that we will just remain forever, not recognizing that we have to go to a future life. And so long as we don't think about that future, we won't sort of act on it. So we need to counteract that kind of grasping at permanence, recognize that we will have to die, and thereby take advantage of the time that we have.
And it's in this book, Jangilia, Shenji Chate, Mato Shanda, some Maguya Chiorwa, Sendilipe, Ketchum Shevuchi, Sendi Chibut on the Net and Luda Longulis Obachi, Benjotan in the side Chibut on the Samutan de Yoran and Gimazo, Timato Samke Koyo Marwa. So, Tanjunica Telon by Yula Sambe, Sendi Chibul Bear, no, the Beshem, Shenja Shukshin Buyovate, de Mare Segura. Vila Kumbetsen de Nangshados. Lende Melukoe Dongan Yang Sam Nasa. Lende Melukoe Dongan Yasa. That's the Tanjunia Telomebo Sam, let's send in Nashe, the Shenja Shuk Chimbu, Timado Sabi Bangas and the so that they take Kagan Dram Shugul and Num Tibanesh, Shenjas Material Sebas, Shugul and Num Retinent, so Kagas as Maris or this or Ila come sende nascendo. Che con le de meluque dongenamsi. O le che faceva le tene e ne tendo da meta che sul giro deve chiudi che vatere. E ne tunge che mi che vasa sona ne sono la sua tunge io e kango mi che devo de torwa. Le de melu se le chiudete le collo io mare. Le che vasa vote che vasa per passare sempre tanto te devo mingere about. Migi wasabi na migi wasabi pacha te so sempre te gore ti devo tunge mingi ora. Lende milu sulo meba. Kepsan te che ti bucene kauda che io ma devo ngebato mingere sura. Ti bucene che wacene karina. No, lende milu ne. Lende milu koe tunge sta koalia. No. Ko ngarazo medicine ko avare ora. And then the longi to Tunga Mamuchora, and the Melukoya Tunga, Kivetunga, Kevetunga, Navetunga, Chivetunga, Kisegmar and Devati San Maniva, Mendibo Todo Paba, Kenitunga Mamuyordo, Yane Yandu Koyato, Yane Yandu Tomato and Juasero, Neva Meve and Gavasero, Momba Meve and Gavasero, or Tunga Mamuyora. Tizukanga Lake Bretan Kyochima Dreda, today Lake Break Samu to Yabo Kore Nesogora, Lende Melukoe Tunganam Yaya Samna, and Kyochima Lata me Koban Chibutoba in Samsa, Kobaja Toba Chibu Samsa, Koala Shenjati Maverick Resogora. And the Magic Kibuchungu de Gene, Yason Magib Lada Milike Nasam Kisambiwa. Yina ko kibu dringe sam go hada miliki ne tarwa trogu sam sanje ko ba trogu sam yorwa madol hada mi ko ba koran chok to kibu do tobje taddu ge chege marwa o tisun da kasa lende melo ko to ngan mi ya samna chime nang shen do se chima hada mi ko ba le ya shenja che tian do do de so gora ko e do ngai ran shin ba shin te ya bu de ma do sa taina te tele tene ane tarwada tabje chembo tuye tendu kugure sambumado koran jebul shenja chesage taddu ke tobjaga re mendo samti sam ko boyara 뭐였다 드셔라.
So, by thinking again and again about the kind of familiarizing our mind to the fact that this life is so precious, but it is also impermanent, then this will allow us to eliminate seeing just this life as so important. We won't just think of the sort of like abode and possessions and body of this life, because we recognize that although it's precious, it's something that is not going to remain. So here, this is, we are really sort of attached to the life that we have in the way that, like oil on paper, when oil gets into paper, you can't separate it out. We have this kind of craving for this life. And it is through these contemplations that we are able to sort of get rid of that attachment, to remove that kind of craving and attachment. And so as this verse continues, it says, by contemplating repeatedly the truth of karma and samsaric suffering, preoccupations with the next life will come to cease. So here we can, by contemplating the fact that virtue and non-virtue are undeceiving, it is the case that virtue is the cause of happiness. When we engage in virtues, that will lead to a happy, a pleasant result. And when we engage in non-virtues, that is going to lead us to experience suffering. And that is something that is not deceiving. Those results will definitely, those causes will definitely ripen as those results. We are definitely going to have to experience the results of our actions. And when we think about sort of samsaric suffering, here we as humans know the kind of sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. We know the sufferings of not getting what we want, of having to meet with things that we don't want. And as we contemplate more, we can see the sort of sufferings of having to go up and down. Like sometimes you're high, sometimes you're low. There's no contentment to be had in samsara. No matter how much we pursue, we can't actually feel satiation. And so here, just having the thought to gain a good rebirth, someone who really thinks about the suffering nature of samsara doesn't see that as something that is a goal. Instead, they want to gain liberation from this process of continuing to cycle within samsara. So this kind of contemplation of the undeceiving nature of karma, cause and effect, as well as the suffering nature of samsara, these contemplations eliminate the kind of grasping or preoccupation with just future lives. It's not as though they totally sort of cast away the need for such a life, but rather someone like, whereas for the being of small scope, a good rebirth as a human was the desired goal. For someone who is contemplating the sort of scope, the middling scope, they see that this sort of basis is necessary in order to pursue liberation and omniscience, but it's not a goal sort of in and of itself. This is not the end goal, is to just have a human rebirth, because by seeing the suffering nature of samsara, there's a wish to be freed from that. So again, by contemplating repeatedly the truth of karma and samsaric suffering, preoccupations with the next life will come to cease.
Nên cái khổ của phải tái sinh đi tái sinh trở lại rất là nhiều lần. Rồi có những cái điều là bấp bênh không xác định được mình có lại được những cái điều trong tương lai, những điều mình muốn hay không. Nên cái khổ nữa là chúng ta không bao giờ thỏa mãn được những cái điều mà hạnh phúc an lạc, cái khát vọng ở trong sanh tử luân hồi. Có nghĩa là chúng ta không bao giờ biết thỏa mãn những gì mình có. Nên không nên là tham đắm vào cái đời này. Chiều chúng ta có được thân cõi trời, cõi người là cõi lành, là nó không phải là mục đích đến cuối cùng. Cho nên khi mà được sinh cõi lành thì nhờ đó
왜 편조라 예미까지 사람에 계시셔라. 인생 군도 타르바 되니로 중나 되서 인중께 발라서라. 근데 삼루다네. 아니 인생 군도 타르바 되니 다 코알레 타르바 시체고도 삼상게 삼루께 고어도 인생 군도 타르바 되니로 중나 되서 인중 코알레 네번 중세데 근데 삼루 코스네 코알레 네번 중아데 소거라. 코알레 네번 중세 단도 가지고 코알레 sempa 슈데요라. 다들 아들 야보면도 섬수 수로 용게들 민중식이라 그는 남주 소소 가분예버지 야보 쉐비체 딱그 도자를 쉐비체 딱그래 야보데면도 삼사 당부파 가보 쉐비예버데 수로로데 콜랭게가 중에서도 저게 통네 님의 현자의 대기요 말와 어디내서 거라 그다 공부 코에 본절에 예매 깨지자 코에 배송서와 내 배송서와 류 배송서와 로즈 배송서와 로 배송서와 야가도 가려나한테 이대게 메도 삼고 닝부 메게레사 유런도게레사 동해지랑 신체레사 야가지는 탐들을 누가 지가 다 조사라 근데 그 동해지랑 신체레사네 아니 인생 가디이나 인다세 가디 삼루타나 타르바톰 나와서 코알레 땐도 타르바시 제고도 삼 근데 삼로 코스는 코알레 네버 좋아래 코알레 네버 좋으면 코알레 탄데께 그래 탄데께서나 코 두고이 바하고나 코알레 탄데께로와 아니 타레 탑시 카르도스데 아니 다 다음에 공부스 그래서 아주 템바신도서 메다 동해에서 동해 야보시 하고서나 아니 동해 교카레스 kunjure ki tome mari pa tangje de ti karis meso hotel soya yo se yo re tarwa yo re ta lam kom gores palamela keshe so ti chilone
So here, as you habituate in this way, and when not even an instant of admiration or craving arises for the prosperities or excellencies of cyclic existence, and when this thought of aspiring for liberation arises day and night, at this point, true renunciation has arisen. So here, by thinking like this, by contemplating the kind of suffering nature of samsara, we get to a point where we say, I need to get to liberation. I need to definitely get out of this situation of samsara. And so it is in this way that we give rise. I mean, renunciation really means like definitely emerge. It's this sense of wanting to get out of that, where we have reversed the normal sort of craving or desire for the excellent things of samsara. Like there might be someone that we really like, and we really are attracted, attached to that person. And then all of a sudden, we see some sort of fault in them. And that reverses, we feel like a revulsion toward that person, or we don't have that kind of liking that we did anymore. We see them completely differently. And so whatever is considered to be good, excellent, desirable within samsara, we can come to see this as not being sort of trustworthy or reliable. There's no essence, there's no real nature to that, but rather it's in the nature of suffering. And so thereby, contemplating thereby, we give rise to a wish to get a definite freedom from that cycle of suffering, this wish to be out of that. And this sort of develops from looking at, well, what is the method? Again, based upon, as we've been discussing, the presentation of the Four Noble Truths, we need to understand our kind of suffering situation and then identify, well, what is the cause of that suffering? And is it something that can be removed, can be eliminated? And as taught with the truth of cessation and the truth of the path, that yes, there is a method for gaining a freedom from that suffering. And it is through the cultivation of the sort of selflessness, understanding selflessness, and in particular as well, the eightfold Arya path or noble path. These are the methods by which one can effectuate such a cessation of suffering. So based upon seeing the suffering nature of things, one generates this kind of renunciation. And that is what compels one to engage in the various methods that lead to such a freedom from samsara.
대다 공부 거의 편주 이미게 지산되겠어. 거의 편주 가리나 그 삼루군에 땅이나 야가지 중순의 대지를 누워도 영에 다 쳐사로 그님도 낼 되어라. 순사선의 야부지 내놓고 시에 다 쳐사를 로춘주인의 개에 다 쳐사를 근데 그 야가지는 대대 돼야 돼. 타마도 돼야 돼. 다 쳐사라 거의 편주야. 다 그게 맞으면 매셔라. 야가지 가래 주마들이야. 공부를 자식이 차수는 깨달아서 지만 요리지 샤구로 마동도라 동부이나 필승소가 가리는 그 땅도 대고 말았고 지만 매우 세디야 동해 지기 와라 어떻게 그 코에 편종이야 이미시에 메두삼 가이님부 가야 메두삼 사르치 진짜 삼고 요리다 따따단다 가지고 때네 세상 가서 대전이가 제일 농매 봐 일을 공부했는데 나셔도 그래서 강가 삼루동 세거라 곰 잡수고 대서 곰거라 곰제 쪼데 심지 간간 대도 말을 슝난의 셰베 곰데 삼루동에 제고 망쳐라 슝강가 타부를 자주고 셈다니지다 동반이다 대전이가 강가 제고라 다시 라고 곰바나시 거야마 제바전에 삼루동으로 어디디고 대전이가 와래 삼이가다 칼루 삼루동 하러 셀롱이 체데 유럽부 때지 말해서 시황 예버리 대한 남식에 매래서 삼루다 어떤데 삼루다는 공작이 와라 일라 공배네 천대 낭셔디 신자디 슈초초초 노라 타버리 삼다 렌데멜 코에 동에 남수도 겨와치마다 지단 코에 동에 참마 하다 미다 강거리 동에 삼루다 지대나 코에 동에 양에서는 치매나니 겨와치마 기부충이 있는 하다 미 고반데 야부인 섬 뒤토에 삼루 쪼여봐. 다단데 기분 링르와데. 코알레 땐도 타래 코라 하다 미에 코알레 딜레 타에 삼고고 와라. 자고 하다 밀게나 디땡레야 땡디 르딘디 베주샤샤네 타로 탐제 김부 투레 땡레마도 코라장장님 무레메도 선님부 요바시 마레 삼루고 와라. 코에 동에디 가라서 코아 바로 왔다. 코에 동에 양대기 와라. 자, 코에 동에 양대도 코에를 내반 조구는 가지고 나를 데데데데데서 소수 용도 삼다요라. 다 기부충을 해지네. 돈을 깨는 기부충을 내줘 삼을단데 소수 돈도 말아. 돈을 깨나 동에 딘데데 도와 딘데데 용구도 삼사. 이달 깨나 사야메 통에 딘데데 동에 양구래 삼. 디삼을단 딜메 집시고 삼사. 내반 조구라. 단데 깨요 말아. 예선을 깨어 말아 이내 예선 통해 삼네 네번 종교가라 텔레타로 제고 삼 기부 총의 삼을 거기도 와 단데 기분 대다 전부 삼단단 거라 코아 코라레 타르고 레시데 어디지 텐데 삼을 따네 야네 양도 삼을 따 엔티 텐데 도아 삼셈샤 야 삼을 따 텐데 오늘 레도 삼을 따 디첸조세라 제바체 삼을 따 에네테 대전이 가르쳐라. 대전이가 어려서 좀 실내 롱게요 말에 매바래 삼사된 걸 셈샤. 야데 삼루다 어떤 데서는데 범식거라. 제곰시도 삼루다는 디디디디 삼루다더라. 에 타마도 어떤 데서 삼삼파 대가리 삼루다 샤고라. 텔레 조금씩거라. 어디 생각도 남기다 디셔도 곰슬 납대고 말아. 띵념도 자고 말아. 자고 말면 곰세게 와라. 곰해야 돼. 곰제소 어때서다. 텐션이가 셀러롱에 봐. 일을 곰고야. 와. 렌데 멜로코에 동에 남 야냐 삼습나. 아니 코알랭 개반지고야다. 어때서 강가요구라. 그 안에 한도 삼땅구라. 야, 띵망 로체 다들 노티스.
So here again, when as you habituate in this way, when not even an instant of admiration or desire arises for the prosperities of cyclic existence, and we have this desire to gain liberation, then this again is the kind of renunciation of a being of middling scope. So here, whatever we have, it is sort of connected with the bad that's going to happen. So just being alive means that we are going to die. Being youthful means means that we are going to age and so forth. And so we need to contemplate like that. We need to think about these things in this way. So when we use this word like habituate, it's actually the word meditate. Most of the meditations that we do, particularly like with the stages of the path or other things, is really mostly analytical meditation. When we think about how it is difficult to find this kind of human rebirth, we think about that it won't remain and so forth. That contemplation is like analytical meditation. This is the way in which we reduce that kind of strong grasping at being preoccupied with this life or with our future lives and so forth. And so here, I mean, sometimes we engage in placement meditation like on a deity or something, but this is different. Most of the kind of meditation that we are talking about in terms of these various points is really dependent upon our thinking about it, analyzing and investigating for ourselves. And really, so for a being of small scope, they look at a rebirth as a human or a god as something desirable, something that they sort of want to get. Whereas for the being of middling scope, they see that there's no real essence to that. There's nothing that that's not really in the nature of true happiness, but rather we need that kind of a life in order to be able to obtain liberation or omniscience. This is sort of a tool in that process. And so for a being of small scope, they are trying to avoid rebirths as, say, an animal or a hell being, a hungry ghost. And they look at those kinds of existences. Like imagine, what would it be like to be an animal? They're not actually an animal right now, but they think about what it would potentially involve to experience that kind of suffering existence. Whereas for the being of middling capacity, we can really reflect on our own experience as a human, the kind of sufferings that we experience, looking at all of the various things within samsara, and we can contemplate and see how they are all within the nature of suffering. And so in order to generate that kind of renunciation, wishing to get out of samsara, this is necessary for us to think, to contemplate on these various things. And so there is as we go through these points, a place for some placement meditation. We engage in a kind of analysis, say, thinking about how difficult it is to obtain such a human rebirth, and then place the mind on that for a little bit, and again analyze, and then place the mind. And so here, often when we go through many of these points, they might not use the language of meditate, like they use the language of think about again and again, but that's really what we are engaging in, is meditation. It is critical for us to analyze, not just sort of place the mind on things, but rather we can place the mind once we have found a degree of certainty that comes through that kind of contemplation. So this is the way in which we are able to generate these understandings and realizations, from the difficulty of obtaining a human rebirth to the suffering nature of samsara and so forth.
Nên chúng ta suy nghĩ rất kỹ về cái khổ đau trong loài vật. Thì từ đó mà nói, nếu như mình sinh loài vật, làm sao mình có thể chịu đựng được, rồi sinh vào cái loài ngạ quỷ
야, 다 된듯이거든. 뭐래도 단지 단지 보셨잖아. 더 등당하죠. 개배 동네에서 어디 주셨냐고 이제. 개배 동네에서도 가해 동네에서도 다 계속 좀 동네 지세 했던데 마다 가시고 어디서도 기가서도 계속나 암조 마더바 미기 야보 마도와 그러 칼라 야보 삼베도게 아니 니뭐 그거에 살아 아니 빠진 두들 좀 마도데 어디서 동네에서 요라 근데 동네 요라서 요라 알아서 가시 티스도 어디 경고 전때나 마den jogoshine karse de kashi tende o te tebe del ko dunge che ke yo mare tambu ne kengo ji ke be na ni kha yo marwa lo chunju che de ya kengo chara di mi kang ga chaya ra ma do chunga jo kengo chaya ra ma do ma cha ji yo marwa o ti ndi kar so da une che ne che thar che so sa ka ko bo de ma ju ne ke sam sa sibde ke me do 다 나한테 전에 것에 맞아 용거를 받아 계속 그 체력부터 정상 가와 공부라 현대도 체력부터 저임에 된데게 요 말아 한다 그 체력부터 타르신 버와 체력부터 정나 텔레를 배 마시지 대하네 요 말아 그 코티 선배체 매래 가지고 시계바나 용거 봐 링거를 지날 미망부 소사치야 로천주도 미가가 도라 니 미겐고치 코베 고고체네 정말 주신 도래 니 미가가 때문에 그 아케텐데 가게 컨디션에서 계지티 지기 와라 아니 되라래 저도 체력부터 아니 저도 해서 체력부터 아니 저기 있어야 되니 체력부터 아니 전에 된다 차고 그랬어라 체력부터 아니 뭐 자냐지 체력부터 요 말아 შემ바자냐지 세르무데요 말아. 에케니 진조리 유유제 케셰니 세르무데요라. 어디인데 가시 어디 심베도와 데 만디레. 네 케나 그 니마직 대야추나 남버르시네 그 잠바다 녀지 창주심 다치면에 동반이 매네 잠바다 녀지세로 서방기세로 텐데 삼다요라. 심제 탐제 대화 대전 담바줄이 근데 시스템이 좀 칸에 라베고 코라케 바상보래 페소나 마무사비와래 근데 그 니마치 대비네 그 잠두치에 요래 산주주 출려지네 심지어 탐제 대화 대화지는데 맞을세로체 근데 테니 테니 산주바차 요라 니마치 대나야 뭐지 이거 가게 삼로타에 매니 따루스데 최면에 깔레도가 최우 삼로라치 요네 그 지마데 경고 찬에 또서 팽도와 아니 그 시구 경계수를 다그 대 삼을제만 라 어디인데 가서래 대가서 하고고라도 개베 동에서로 어디서 간가 지단에 그 코아가 동에를 시세 계속 써보지 오마도 야가시는 냠도 동에 요래 어디제더니 동에 대해 숨묘라 동에 숨디싱에는 셔네 해보지래 동해지 동에서 유래 동해 개반도시 동에서 고려 동해들이야. 동해지 동에서도 가라서 고나 지지 동해 무슨 양에 시와와 전주에 이제 하고 해서도가 그 버시는 거 나는 동해 이거도 전주에 하고 그러라. 나 사실은 동해 이거도 건조 하고 그러라. 일레 동해지 동에서 요래. 그 주디까지 대선에 동해랑지 대기를 마도 대화 차이에 개요 말와. 저번에 시선 같이 쉬는 동해지 대기라. 동해지 동해서래. 동해라 동해지 유산의 동해지 동해서 양지 대야와. 유래 동해서래. 유래 동해서는 가는 소화 대화들에서 거라. 코에 소화 대화시 거라. 어때 유르소는 동해를 누구래. 유르소나. 그나 미치 시부지 타니로. 아니 님만도 좀 보지 렉션에 담보들 빼 가부여라테 소대와라와 다야 붙여서서 다 대대대서 님만에 야채용구라 그 대왕원에 이나 님의 죄대 대왕원에 이나 이제 다가 대화를 하자 대화 그러대 대기 말에 당에 동해 여자 동해대 매버려 telea 대화 삼소서 삼록파 슈르 캡지 삼교어마도 이게 대화롱교어래 저라 근데 그 대한 교르스는 동해래도 그래 대화대 담부 대화를 대 교르니까지 레슨에는 그 동해래도 그래 어디서 telling 유래 동에서라. 코에 대화 컨디션에 코 유네 타마들 동에치 차도 그래. telling 유래 동에서 가라주 직대버 대화 써야 돼. 좋아. 어디 빼나 다들 유래 동에서. 개번 두지기 동에서라. 개번 두지기 동에서는 감숨바 코아바 상말 캡되어라. 빼나 가라주 소부다부터 샤나 되그래. 좋아. 감숨 강갈 깨와질라네 레다 유무배왕게 풍부실랑 거로와. 텔레 개번 두지기 동에서라. 감숨가 강갈 캡거라. 동에다 유래 동에니데 상말 요 말해. 미다냐와이다 던두도 요로와. 아니 이게 대사서 이게 삼대 담부니 버세도래. 그래서 요 말해. 동에 요 말해. 유에 동에 매게 차려 버르지 대화요. 소화 땅념도 야가지 와라. 소화라 대화도 동에 삼로 요나네 망냥 거라. 야부 조선은 가쳐줘 또 부주 양들 말소세. 야 가쳐줘 야 두쳐줘 싶어. 소화 거라 땅념 전에부터 야가요. 땡기지 광고 야는데 소화 땅념마도 요 말해. 개번 두지 동에도 요라. 레다 염모배원 그 고교와서랑 되어라. 그 랭유지 상황에서 버루시한테 소화도 현대식 때도라. 개번 두지 있어도 감송 그 강갈이야. 고에 교와 참말 캡에 삭쟁이 일이 풍부다고 돼. 교와도 소수 단단한 좀 멜시아는 소수 소부다고 돼. 개번 두지 동에서 되어라. 어디 동에 숨겨라. 어디 이제 다 된다 망부마시. 다 된다 고에로 와. nghe xong cái samul tan nghe xong cái tung ele nghe ban chung nghe xong cái tung ele tharwa che ko sam ti ten da le mi ke wa chu pa ke wa chu ko sam sa ki bu chung samul ta chi na la da mi le ke na ko tung e ran shi ji ko tham je tung e ran shi le ma de ba yin sam ko ye phun so kan de chi na tha de gui be de wa tha de gui be chi ma do ga ji wa tha chu sa ko ya ga chi shon di chi do ga ya tha chu sa la 코에 부승사고 간데지네 다 구베티바 매스 마티바 매삼네 네 코에 동엘에 땐도 타르바체고 삼사 대한 라치부 마이바 심제 참마 탐제 동엘에 타르바차 tum겐게 사제지 고만 토바차 윙에삼 대치도 네 처리야 토바체 삼바체 야네 양도 콤디치 윙에삼네 처리게 삼나 kuno setamne nyanani ke olap chambusagora sanje je koma tobe chede shus yagi samgora tanda namsanda sanje koma ke togyo marde kuno de o tende sel da pura samutangura o tende kuno setamne samba shus ta de tendes ya.
So here we need to then contemplate the sort of suffering of our different types of suffering. So for example, the suffering of aging, we might think of this as being like, oh, well, when you get really old and you can't hear and you can't see, you can't eat, you can't sort of go around. Some people might even think like, oh, well, if I die younger, then that would be good. Because really, if we are youthful, it's not as though there's going to be some point where we like hit old age. It's rather, it's something that's happening all of the time. And if one wants to live a long life, then you have to age. You can't avoid sort of aging. And so here, according to Buddhists, to live a long life, to have this life for a long time is something that we should see as very valuable. So going back to the earlier sort of point, in Aryadeva's 400 verses, he talks about a scene sort of like in a park where there's lots of different people walking around, and there's an old man like all sort of bent over and hunched over and going very slowly, and these young people are looking at him and thinking like, oh, well, you know, and sort of giving him grief. And he's like, well, don't you want to live a long life? Well, you are going to have to face the same sort of fate. And so here, to have even one more day of our life, if we use it well, to have even one more day to develop love and compassion or emptiness, or even just to say prayers, to be able to like recite the 4 immeasurables or have those kinds of positive thoughts, that is something that is very fortunate opportunity. And so we should We might not be able to always recognize this, but I mean, if say we are aging in a way that we are not able to really think and contemplate and use our life well, that's maybe a different situation. But so long as we are alive, even if we are subject to the sort of sufferings of aging and our declining health and so forth, to be able to use this as a meaningful kind of a life, to do virtue, is something that is very precious. But so we need to recognize the kind of situation that we are in as suffering, and not sort of see like as a youth, like, oh, aging is something that'll come later or something. We are aging from the time that we are born, and we need to recognize the suffering nature of things. And this means understanding the three levels of suffering. There are three basic types of suffering. There's the suffering of suffering. This is things like when we have a headache. This is something that anyone would recognize as being suffering. Like even animals, when they are sick, they recognize that as suffering. They are aware of that. And so as long as that feeling remains or situation remains, we consider it to be suffering. So that's the first type. And then there is the suffering of change. Really, the kind of any sort of happy feelings that we have, any kind of contaminated happiness within samsara, is really within the suffering of change. Like say when we are one day a visitor arrives and we're really excited and happy to have that visitor there. Well, it's not going to remain forever. There will be a point in which you will get sick of them. Or like you think, oh, I'm going to go lay out in the sunlight. That'll be really nice. Really, we are alleviating our suffering of, say, being cold, but it's not as though the more that we lay in that sunlight, the more happy we are going to get. So really, we think that these things are in the nature of happiness, but they're really just a temporary kind of relief of suffering. And all worldly pleasures, all worldly happiness is like this. So then there is the level of suffering that is called, variously translated, the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence. And this pervades all three realms. That's why it's called the pervasive suffering of conditioned existence, meaning that so long as one is taking up and casting off aggregates due to the force of karma and the afflictions in this uncontrolled kind of way, this is suffering. This is something that applies to all of the realms. So in the higher kind of realms, say the form and the formless realms, they're not subject to, say, the suffering of suffering or the suffering of change. They have developed like a high degree of this sort of equanimity, this equipoise, wherein they don't have the kind of coarse feelings of sufferings, but they are still subject to the suffering of pervasive conditioned existence, meaning that they aren't going to remain in that kind of meditative state forever, but rather they are going to have to, subject to their karma, take rebirth and continue to cycle within samsara. And so it is by thinking about, for a being of small scope, the sufferings of the lower realms, of wanting to avoid those, that one takes up a practice of avoiding non-virtue, of avoiding harming others and engaging in virtue in order to get a good rebirth in the future. But then recognizing that whatever it is, even if we are to be born as a human or a god, it's not going to remain. Whatever we have within samsara is subject to degeneration, to going away. And so we need to recognize that kind of suffering nature to generate the aspiration of the being of middling scope, that thinks, I want to gain a kind of definite freedom, get out of this cycle of suffering. And then there is thinking even beyond that, wishing to gain that state of Buddhahood, wherein one has eliminated all faults and gained all good qualities in order to be able to help all sentient beings who are in this same situation. And so thinking in this way, we should set a really positive intention for listening to these teachings, because by setting such an intention to gain the state of Buddhahood, even though that's not something we can gain immediately, we can obtain immediately, by setting this intention, we are creating the causes. It creates a powerful amount of virtue that will go toward that cause. So please set a good motivation for listening to the teachings.
Sơ thiền nhị thiền đó, thì ở trong trạng thái lúc nào ở trong cảm thấy xả thọ, tại vì xả thọ cái cảm thọ đó là tốt nhất trong các trong ba loại thọ. Ví dụ như mình được thì mình vui, mà không vừa lòng mình khổ đau, nhưng các vị sẽ không bị cái khổ vui nó chi phối. Các vị lúc nào cũng bỏ để đặt cái tâm ở trạng thái là xả thọ, nghĩa là cái cảm thọ trung tính đó. nên là các vị không có khổ đâu, không có khổ và hội khổ. Nhưng mà các vị vẫn còn cái hành khổ, giống như cái thân của mình là hành khổ, mình đang rất là dễ chịu như vậy, mưng cái thân này do nghiệp phiền não, nên bản chất của nó là hành khổ. Tại vì do nghiệp phiền não nên chúng ta nhận lấy các cái uẩn để có cái thân này. Tuy là không có đau đớn là thuộc khổ, mà cái cảm giác vui dễ chịu đó là thuộc hội khổ, tại vì nó sẽ biến chuyển. Còn cái thân này bản chất của nó là hành khổ. Nên khi chúng ta suy nghĩ trong sinh tử luân hồi như vậy, nó không có gì là bền vững, bản chất toàn là khổ đau, nhưng chúng ta sinh cái tâm nhàm chán muốn từ bỏ sinh tử luân hồi, đó là hạng bậc trung. Còn những cái hạng bậc tiểu là chỉ muốn để thoát khỏi những khổ của những địa ngục, ngạ quỷ, súc sinh để sinh vào cõi trời, cõi người. Dù ở như thế nào thì chúng ta thấy ở trong sinh tử luân hồi tất cả đều là khổ đau, dù có vinh hoa phú quý tới đâu, kết cục của nó cũng là khổ đau. Nên vì lý do đó con muốn thoát ly cái khổ đau của cõi cõi trời, cõi người, và khổ đau của tất cả chúng sinh. Cho nên con nghe cái bài pháp ngày hôm nay, nếu chúng ta phát khởi cái động cơ như vậy là cái cơ hội rất tích lũy để công đức vô lượng. Nên hiện tại con chưa đạt được Phật quả, nhưng vì muốn đạt được vào vị Phật nên con lắng nghe cái bài pháp hôm nay để dần dần đi qua
전부 가르쳐 써야 되는 거라 뒤진 가르쳐. 근데 엄마 tengiwa tozoge tegba chembe do shirabji paro tojime do tozo kelenge ora shirjingi dos bumse sholkan bum yuben dochi ora nichisi ani ke tomba se kendi tu somse te shirjingi dos ora shirabji paro tojime dos chanju semta tomba ni da tozo shege ora o titanda tegmese ora ta tingsan tegmese labjo mare segito tegmese mevese rechera tangema chane ko samlo jingdo bichane tegba member to ra tabato et zo chigora tegba chenbu de ra member ra zo me shen zo cheche shengi tentwele sanje ko ma tabde chigora ti samlo chegtone member ta tegba chenbu tegba member segora 택바스는 그 죄제리시오라 모자다 남루다 저줄 택바시오라 그 죄제시오라 죄제시 뒤전에 명다요라 자이네 등사야 근데 대주전에 현달은 내요라 택바 산제의 송 시진 각해 말은 몇세 현다 강가 타르와 토베다 저주 집어 팔라면라 계세로 계속 집어요 템바실로 소버서 강가 어tozo 탈리아다 바르마다 스리랑카다 저주 강가 단다 빼야보도와 결론도시다 김치다 빼야보셔제 건조 그 세진기 너도도 kelling 말와 다트서 다 택바 쳔부 가서도 저게 심장바다 엄마바도 택진기 너도 kelling 거라 이 택바 쳔부데 산지수 다디서 봐라 대바시 메다서 주루 또네 땅미친도가 그 랑게토베 세기 다음에 봐서라 공부를 tension 다음에 봐서라 어떤데 치료바가 요새 다데 딱봐 지부랑 뛰어 말을 산제 송버와 대소선 낭발이야 다음에 버마와 세거라 어디 검는 대신보다서 주도 검리에는 타르바 톱송여라 대면도 값 어디 되기도 하세 대택바 전복에 야 동반이 시시에도 하세 랑원에 주베 동바 시신이 되어 값 어디 만들어서 시거라 뱀바통에 저기 동리통에 지시자 인심에다서 주도 송샤베티 돈은 타르토로도 캐나다가 동반이 또 그래서 랑은에 주베 동반이 시시에도 하세 어디 타르토가 고 말해서 뱀바통에 타르토로도 콜레스테롤도 동리통한테 그거 말해서 그라 다들 제바침을 내잖아 어디 산재기 택바침을 넣어가서 똥이 또 맨날 타르토고 말했어 그래서라 간실 롱래 람데네 매버 자주 매버 송스도 산재기 택바침을 넣어가서 롱기 값어 아니 랑윈에 주베 동바다 마도나 타르와 톱투고 마레스 년도이나다 랑제이나다 대신 타르와 가르 톱나야 동바니 또 그래 소도 아세라 아니 콘줄레한테는 어떻게 계란 대바 챔피언 도데 계란게 켈링을 맞아 가지 켈링 매세라 대바 챔피언 도데 산제 까 마레스 디나 셰바데 템바 마레스 랑윈에 동바이나 아니 가게 매게 차그래 랑윈에 동바이나 추강게 매세게 레스 제발 말해도 그래서 뒤선저 롱디 체마 말에 뒤선제까지 방아주 켈링 매세라 와 다 뒤질이야 안에 계란게 네 텐데 계란게 택바 멤버가 노토서 강가 산제까지 봐 간디스 켈링이 어세 뒤선에 뒤오든 잡아대 오다 야 뒤선나 근데 그래
So here we are at the point in the text where we're explaining that the Mahayana for those practitioners of the Mahayana, they accept as the speech of the Buddha those texts dealing with the perfection of wisdom. So there's like the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra in 100,000 lines, one in 20,000 lines, one in 8,000 lines, the great, middling, and small sort of. And these texts explain things like bodhicitta and emptiness and so forth. And so previously we used to use the word sort of Mahayana as greater vehicle and Hinayana lesser vehicle. And this is nowadays seen as sort of derogatory to say that someone is lesser. Really, these terms are based upon the sort of extent of the aspiration of the practitioner. To strive just for one's own liberation is less than striving for Buddhahood to benefit all sentient beings. And so we don't want to use this in a way that is derogatory. It's really just referring to the sort of extent of the aspiration of the practitioner. And we see that there's a lot that is the same, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, Noble Path, and so forth. There are practitioners who accept these kinds of practices. Sometimes in English we say Theravada, like in Thailand and Burma and so forth, who hold incredibly pure ethical conduct and really have admirable practice. It is, though, the mind only and the Madhyamaka, the middle way philosophical schools that accept the Mahayana as being the speech of the Buddha. And so here again, going to what is commonly accepted within the 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths, all Buddhists are assert no self in the sense of there is like outsiders assert, there is not, as outsiders assert, some kind of permanent, unitary, autonomous self. And particularly, they assert, these lower schools, that selflessness implies the sort of lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. And so here, for those that are of the Hinayana or the lesser vehicle, not in a derogatory way, but they say that, again, in the first half of verse 40, that liberation is gained from seeing truths, the Four Noble Truths. So what is the point in perceiving emptiness? And so they say, well, why do you need that kind of assertion that there is no objective existence? It is possible to, they would assert, to gain liberation by just seeing the selflessness as it is explicated as one of the 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths. And so in response to that says, well, the scriptures, the Mahayana practitioner responds by saying in the second half of verse 40, the scriptures state that there is no spiritual awakening without this path. So here, in response, the Mahayanas say that, well, the Buddha has taught that one needs to realize emptiness, this lack of objective existence, lack of inherent or true existence, in order to gain liberation, any level of liberation from samsara. And this is asserted in the Buddhist scriptures. And so the the non-Mahayanists then return to that by saying, well, you accept that those are the scriptures of the Buddha, but we don't accept that. So if we were to accept the idea that there is no objective existence, or that phenomena are empty of having this kind of existence from their own side, that would lead to total non-existence. That would lead to a nihilistic kind of view. And so here they reject the idea that those could be the scriptures of the Buddha. They're not willing to accept that. And in the first part of verse 41, it says, now it may be argued by Hinayanists that the Mahayana scriptures are not established as the Buddha's teachings. So then the question becomes, well, Hinayanists, how is it that, on what grounds is your own canon established? And this is then when we'll pick up the argument.
지나고 택배 준비 너도서 간가 산지에 뒤 가서 그래 용자치는 소요 말아 박배 땜바실러서 버텨서 용자치 소 택배 준비도 용수 잡고치는 소요 말아 되지 지마 뒤에단 택배 준비잖아 뒤에 깨와서 원본 넘보 텐데 가셔야 송샤마도 용자치 소요 말을 거라 그래서 내만 밑으로 추년도 최대 제고가 시작을 지러 최대 시간에 텐데 제고로서 등에 지금 생각을 쓰고 그러라 아니 미가 안 걸려 택배 준비 시원에서는 다그 현재에 전주 셈샤고라 소소레 샹다케 쳐왔지 그래서 샹다데 셈제 탐제 개쳐왔지 그래서 기세우라티 상마를 제토고 말아 아우테 용의 요마를 삼고라 대상가지로 지나 삼겨라 아니 동반이 레스드 쉐코나 마잉게 가셔지 쉐코나 마잉게 차셔를 가셔지야 디치지 인스파 밍다 대점리마도 코란 인게지 비네 라이요 마르세요라 라운에 동바스도 디지털 최대 맹게를 차로로 아주 삼롱원에 단계이나 동반이 쉐든 지바지고라 셴나지고라 소소 나 맹게를 차고라 남규가라서 삼대 나가서 지삼고도와 대원에 동반이 삼게를 지나 그때 맹게기 소화용 거래 지바용 거래 근데 매 말다 땡진 레버를 좋아해 자와치기를 자와치기를 풍불을 때네 다스파 다샤버데 풍불에 로스도 다행게 지와 말데 되게 건조 소보다 샘다 소화다 강가 레가시도 다그 자와치에서 땡진 레버를 좋아 참도 샤워레스 또왜 딱 봤음레스 마도 코란 인게지 비네 송아주 통하나시 라문에 요 마레스 송요라티데 데미강가 로르 쉬에 가보시고라 근데 대과 신부도 용자서 송요 마레 근데 정말 대과 신부 산제 송요 마레 까토와 당보다 근데 제도 까토도 두면도 와서 삼겨라 어디도 가서라 대과 신부 습습아 영해야 돼 그래서 연구도 와 다 대상들이 요 말을 쉬년다들 하나라는 로가르즈라 가리네 바시에셔스라 다음에 생집에서 제토 말을 동반에서는 가요 말을 박자샤 그래서 마시나 사치물에 심마 양생에서 퇴야요 말을 박자샤 그래서 바시샤요라 당연히 상황을 쳐도 들리자 애네 산제가 말을 그래 자가를 힌두처리 내내 상황요라 대주수 디체르마도 산제랑 상황 소요 말에서 근데 제가 연구하라 근데 거기만 산제 무슨 용자신이 소요 말에 어디 손자 저한테 연구하라 이 뭐지 야 어디 손나
So generally, the Mahayana scriptures, these teachings of the Buddha were not widely taught, whereas things like his teachings on the Four Noble Truths were things that were taught in public, were taught to great audiences and kind of spread, were widely taught. But the teachings of the Mahayana were really only taught to those of sharper faculties. I mean, here in the Mahayana, we talk about exchanging our self-cherishing attitude for cherishing others. This is something that is really not easy to do. Some might look at that and think that that's like not something that they could do, or they would reject this based upon this not being possible or something. So here, or the teachings on emptiness too, if we really begin to think about emptiness in a deep way, thinking, sort of getting rid of our sense that things exist objectively from their own side, we see that something instead is really only designated. There's no phenomenon there other than something that is designated on a particular basis. And even when we investigate that basis, we can't find it and so forth. And so there is a kind of fear that can arise when we really think about emptiness. This kind of sense of like, I'm not here. I don't exist in the way that I normally appear. And so here, this is sort of counteracted, balanced by the fact that, yes, everything is dependently originated. It actually functions within that state of emptiness. So when we, like our feelings or our body does something or our mind, we say, oh, I did that, our self did that. And we can speak coherently about that, but it doesn't mean that those things exist in the way that they appear to us. And so again, really deeply contemplating emptiness has the potential to give rise to fear. I mean, things don't exist in the way that they normally appear to us. So at the sort of time of compiling the teachings of the Buddha, the Mahayana scriptures were not included within that. They were not part of that canon that was established. And so here we should recognize that here, although we teach and explain, I'm teaching these Mahayana teachings, it's not necessarily something that we can expect to fully be able to embrace. We're not sort of claiming to be of the sharpest faculties, but rather we're putting down imprints of things like bodhicitta and emptiness and so forth. But this is a point of debate, of contention, whether these are the teachings of the Buddha or not. And even much more so when it comes to Tantra as being sort of for those of the sharpest faculties, as well as something that is debated. There were practices of Tantra in the Hindu tradition, and some would accuse these teachings as also being part of that, saying like, oh, those aren't part of the Buddha's teachings. But again, this has to do with their availability to a widespread audience, whereas there were teachings that the Buddha gave widely. The Mahayana had fewer disciples, really are only intended for certain disciples, and the teachings of Tantra even more so. So here, although we may not be able to put them all into practice, it is something that is valuable to place imprints on our mind. So, in any case, there are those that do not accept the Mahayana as being the teachings of the Buddha, but they accept sort of like the Four Noble Truths and the teachings on things like that as well. They accept the Four Immeasurables. Although, when a Mahayana practitioner says, like, may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness, like how wonderful that would be, may they have those, and so forth, they don't get to the point of saying, may I bring that about. They don't sort of take the responsibility, but they do train in the Four Immeasurables, in love and compassion and joy and equanimity. And so here, this is something where ideally, if we are able to, we should sort of not disparage that which we can't understand. So again, those that only accept these sorts of teachings as being the Buddha's teachings, but they don't accept the Mahayana, we see that that is possible. We see that there are those who might not think that the Mahayana is the Buddha's teaching. And there are those that might accept the Mahayana as being the Buddha's teachings, but they look at the Tantras and think like, oh, those are not the teachings of the Buddha. Look at all of these things like Kriya and Charya and Yoga and Anuttara Yoga. How could this possibly be the teaching of the Buddha? Now here, it's really important that if we aren't able to maybe understand something yet, we just set it aside. Maybe we can't do that kind of practice, but we shouldn't disparage that. Until we reach that level, maybe it's most beneficial to set that aside until the point where it can be beneficial to us. So here, even if we are only a practitioner striving for our own liberation, we shouldn't disparage the Mahayana teachings. Or if we are practicing the Mahayana and we look at the Tantrayana and think like, oh, we shouldn't think, oh, that's not the Buddha's teachings, but rather recognize that maybe those are teachings that are not yet able to be beneficial for us. We aren't yet able to connect with those teachings, but we shouldn't disparage them.
Dù bạn không có thừa nhận vào kinh Đại thừa thì cũng không sao, nhưng mà không nên phỉ báng, tại vì mỗi người sẽ có một cái ngưỡng khác nhau, cho nên có thể bạn không chấp nhận kinh Đại thừa.
Kokasura. Tekba mebe sogorbeta, sotarje. Dona liyabati, tembashila soba, palamela kela soba, namsha sama taboto bechido, namsha mabuti sama, tekba simbu kele gora chaza. Ki dizako tekba meba kele, shida lamda debi namsha sama, tekba simbu shonara chaza gora. Ta digalia, tekba di rangwine trube tongba sera, Thabkhe sensible change simsan utte digal thabe ngor mado shenda te wo member so sham dona ye chama te ba chimbu tina shin kele ora oh yeah tichla andir.
So here, the Hinayana scriptures, those sutras of individual liberation, they contain the teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, the sort of entire presentation of the basis, the path, and the result. And this is common to the Mahayana. So the Mahayana also has that same kind of basis, in addition to teachings on compassion and the lack of objective existence. So in general, most of this path is really the same. So, Buddhists, then, anyone who is a Buddhist, we have this common kind of path, sort of the basis, path, and result. This is common to all Buddhists.
Thì trên cái nền tảng của chân đế và nhị đế thực hành cái đạo lộ đạt được cái quả vị thì đại thừa không bao giờ bác bỏ kinh điển của nguyên thủy và tiểu thừa, tại vì lời của Phật dạy.
Dạ,当然是对来说，当不去了的满足许多，当不去了的满足些，他特别全部给，但他把听没给，都得把他其他嘛都说了，提醒各开门那个发了给我的，可让了听没个都是当不年的可让听没都是三节个人不主要嘛多是个的，可让的三节听没都是三节个人吧，前面人吧三节送也不的。可能看的是一起相送是个的，第二是特别全部来有个是个的，当不去了的满足是，当不年的可能来呀，你的三节送呗，特别每本都是三节送呗，一百的，前面一百的，当不年的可能给咱们的我们要起码特别三百嘛些国内可能的这个马多是个的，当不去了的满足是，健康给你这一些技术可能。Kali judan kengi wanga teba che chene, samba che teba chene, ene kiran tegwa membe doto zo sanje song yinba ta, te tsema yinba yishi nye yu jiro asi gora. Tambu chola di madru, ken kan kine teri yishi ese, yishi nye song ese gora. Oh, teni tekjin laya soso, oh, tena shi tekjin ya chikba de ese gora, teni tekjin laya chongs. Ya tishi kyuna.
So here then picking up in the last line of verse 41, again, the Hinayanist has just said that, well, our scriptures, the ones that we hold in common, are authentic because they are granted authenticity by both of us, or they are accepted by both of us. And so the Mahayanist then responds back by saying, well, then yours was not authenticated from the start. Or really, how it wasn't as though your scriptures, the things that you accept as valid, were valid from the start, but rather you investigated them. And so here in the first half of verse 42, it says, you should acknowledge that the grounds for your belief in the Hinayana canon also apply to the Mahayana. So it was based upon, rather, reflecting on the meanings that are presented in these various texts, that one is able to establish that they are valid. And so it's not as though prior to hearing and thinking about these texts, they were established as valid from the beginning, but rather we reflect on them and develop certainty and belief.
Kelonda Kichuda Kenyela Sogbatazu, Sunja Chidim Yekor Keber Song Yabatichera, Tezuta, Techelia, and Nikasura, Doachera, Dodilla, Dode Tenu Kapsu, anything is a cometa, Comjaya that Tezu Song Yabatezuchera, Tabache Ton Yadese. Mubet and Newcastle, Mubet and Newcastle, she Tower Tel Pabgiora, Xi Nesu Tel Pabgiora, Mubet and Newcastle. Ene shi tawa tenle pabato mengewa roa chimbu temba da nabu temba sege nabu temba sude koala korege ju koda shebate songora chimbu temba sude za koala tarege ju shebate songora o tezu temba te tone kerane tege yichene saje songsha sam te tege tu samza yichinye orwaso tina shin tejin la ya Tene sumnal te samata da yorese. O tiso de tijin la tinashin sanje kayen bada semaye bade kirange kengmegen do sanje kayen bada semaye ba yishinye banashi tijin do tene sumdo tagene yishinye togure songora ya. Ndire da tijin la ya Dira, Tene teaching Laya Chung said. Tambukula Dimadu, Kengan Kene Teri Chise, Tene Sumla Soga Namsha, Te Tonga Tene Keran Kentel Tene Yishi Chong Asura. Or the teaching Tene Nala Tesum Ganga Chimachishi Song Yore. And it teaching is Kayimbatea, Samayimbatea, Teda Sumbe Chusen Dos. Yeah.
Nên lúc đó
So, here again, then it says, you should acknowledge that the grounds for your belief in that Hinayana canon also apply to the Mahayana. The reasoning is really the same because, again, the sort of scriptures were not just accepted from the beginning, but by looking at, in particular, the three baskets of the Buddha's teachings, the Vinaya, which primarily presents sort of extensive teachings on ethical conduct, the various types of lay vows and ordination vows and how one goes about practicing ethics. The teachings of the sutras that primarily deal with, say, meditative stabilization and other practices like that. And then the Abhidharma, the higher knowledge sort of texts, which are the basis for determining the sort of nature of things, for determining the nature of the basis. And so it is based upon those kind of causes of looking at the teachings and saying, oh, these don't sort of contradict one another. I can enter into them as being valid. And so it is based upon that sort of process of coming to determine through scripture and reasoning that these are valid. And so you should hear the Mahayanist speaking to the Hinayanist approach this the same way. You should evaluate the teachings that are given as Mahayana teachings and see whether they contradict because they're actually sort of the same. So here it's saying that one should apply the same kind of reasoning to establish their validity.
Mini some Shanda the Kasha Yobateke, Sama Yimbata, Sanje Kayabatinde, Devayana Sura, Shani, David Ananisa, Sanje Kayabat, Sama Yimbatemba Yimbatinde, Trubuyana Sura, and it regis or Yatembadio, and it regis Chirubabe, regis she says Shura, Conto Kasura. Tina Sheva Sama Tembaris, Tina Shemana, Temba Marese. Ni rikchi di kibi mache bari sigre. Kansa tsam shabatende mara Koran rangshingi ngwebe nezu tenla pamgege pecha rikchi shisa shiwara. O tina sheba tsama shiriba sorta hindi shoto su tenla pabdi tina karindo tawara. Tina yuene temba si tina almenduna ane temba maris. Ti kares ni kibi sheba mare. Kibi sambachi na kari ne kibul kya yore tiende kyanji shashi ugurese. Kura rangshingi gobe nezu da tiba peche si chungurese yora. Ta namba chani teke lik marwa. Tente si kawa yungurese. Rangshingi peche samge mene peche si tandisti. Ta mi shenda kashega deva teki chamata tende dugu yonani rikji shiribe rikji ge shibutia ani chama yimbada temba yimba yurgirese kura. Shani debe tena ne riji so jan tembar yoruse. Tiji lamna ya. Chuje chane ta kurese. Mada denge shani mambu yoma yo chane tebiyena. Ani riji tu so temba yeba denge me mambu yora. Tukta mambu yora tiye tembar yoruse kura. Ya.
Chị nên ở đây nói
So then, if on the other hand, if something were true because two parties assert it, then the Vedas and so on would also be the truth. So here, not sort of looking at the subject matter, but instead saying that, well, if you have two people or two parties that validate or say something is authentic, like above, where it said that because it is granted authenticity by both of us, we can accept these as valid. So if it were the case that a scripture were to be considered valid because it is accepted by two parties as being the truth, truth, then it would follow that things like the Vedas would be the truth because more than two people accept that that is the truth. So, for example, the Vedas, this kind of tradition in which the scriptures are considered to be sort of naturally arisen, not sort of spoken by an ordinary person, but naturally arising in accordance with reality. They sort of express the reality of the world in a way that is not created by a person. So those scriptures are considered to be authentic by more than one person. And so if you use the reasoning that two people or more, two parties or more accepting something makes it valid, then those scriptures too would have to be accepted as truth, as valid. Instead of actually examining the subject matter, to just say that whether it's accepted by multiple parties determines its validity, that's the kind of absurd consequence that even things like the Vedas would then have to be accepted as truth.
어디 출랭자요라 어디 말해서 대진대 산제가 예마일이야 저봐요래서 대팅면 도도저 강가대 산제 지가 예마인가니 저봐게요 말에 계란게 산제가 이바다 템바에 bakhel링도 대진대 저봐셔래서 산제가 인다면다 템바에 인다면데 저제래서 나서거라 대진 저제 실시 나서대 야 되실라나
So then in response, and again, this is sort of the Hinayanist responding back, saying, well, the Mahayana is to be rejected since its authenticity is contested. There's some dispute over whether it is authentic or not. So here, the sort of basics of Buddhism, that basis that we both accept can be valid, they would say. But the things that we contest, because they are contested or disputed, those are not worthy of being accepted. This is their response, and then the Mahayanists will come back.
Tela mudik pada coba yung gura ti temba mare coba yung gura. Ani long shen la ya rashen da long shen da liya chitra ma teba chobje yora meda tesenda meda chobje chore chitra ma teba chobje kiran zuna le sanje ka gashilia kashe ti temba mare se coba yung gura se gura. Long shen la ya rashen da se Shanda Chiruba members Ragi Teba Chobjeg Nane and Sanjay Sumbe Tingmeg Dogashila, Sanjay Sum Yima the Chama Yimaela, Zuba Yunguto Asera, Suje Yencher, Torchanjus, and the Tingman Doctor Sanjay Kamaris, Torchat Vese, Tele Kiranzo, Teba Chobjeg Naloge, Shitamjeg Eberma Teba Ibea, Shitamjeg Eberma Teba said to do. Persi yoba tembe doto zo kele gyomare. Persi sete. Persi sobe dote sanje ka imare se war. Shenda ka ga persi sobate sanje ka kele gora. Persi sena ngazu dine shi sasuna kya la matu be parutele ya sibachi gora. Kele persi si gora. De che de da luda droche. Ani pajo de kesa de tata namsa drobanto che kini paru sibachi gora. Persi si gora. Any part Kyola Sune Kissi Sigra. So Persi the year my ya, Timian Donal so you are the Kasha Dao, the Persi says you Ogmare. She saw some Namsa Kyola to Kyo Shanda Langres, or the Dutch over the Wasavara. The Timian daughters Sanjay Suyeme, then they all married Sameme. They Zuba the Chevara, Keranzo Nampenzo Zubadua, Shiribagadi Zuba Yera, 남편주 저바이 비세시오라 로라 무디 파남다 로셰 라야 라셰다스 라코라즈 테버초게 나로세고라 저제 인체 도르자게니 사게카 마레 세마 마레세 도르자레도 와세 도르자게 바타 아니 케라즈 남편주레 사게카이 마이 저바이 베치세고라 티진 저바이 요사 사게카 마레세라 저바이 요네카 메모 조베네 아니 켄제 Persi yabaten ben dolar sobotezo sanje kamai bare doris. Chitam yabacho yaba nampense shitam yaba mai tebal sobo tezo persi yaba la sanje kamares keling to asegara. Ya. So je yenje torja jurso otisora.
So then it continues with the sort of response from the Mahayanas that say, then since the validity of the entire Hinayana canon is contested by non-Buddhists, and certain other Hinayana scriptures are contested by your own and other Hinayana orders, you should reject them too. So here, when it comes to non-Buddhists, they don't accept Buddhist scriptures. There are points of debate or contestation. And so if being contested is grounds to not accept something, then you would have to say, well, because your scriptures are contested by non-Buddhists, they wouldn't be worth accepting. As well, there are within the Buddhist philosophical schools, like 18 sub-schools that have debate among certain points. There are certain scriptures that some accept as valid and others that they don't accept as valid. And so here, there in particular refers to those that like some assert the existence of a bardo being, some kind of like liminal time between having cast off a previous life, then one is born into the bardo and then transitions into another rebirth. Well, there are particular schools like those that, and the names are a little bit, they like assert the existence of all bases. They would say that no, one doesn't have, those scriptures that teach a bardo being are not valid. One dies and immediately takes another rebirth. It's sort of like direct rebirth. So here within the various sub-schools, there is debate, there is dispute over which scriptures are authentic or valid and which are not. And so if one should reject things just because they are subject to debate, then we see there's debate with outsiders, with non-Buddhists contesting what scriptures are valid. But even within Buddhists, there is some kind of dispute about what is valid or not. And so if something just by being debatable is worth sort of casting aside, then it would follow that really even the things that you consider valid would have to be cast aside because somebody debates them, contests them.
Không phải là Phật dạy luôn hay sao? Tại vì các bộ ngoại đạo đương nhiên họ đã không chấp nhận lời Phật dạy, họ có tranh cãi về giáo lý của Đức Phật, và trong nội bộ các ông cũng tranh cãi về giáo lý.
오늘 리버타는 쪽이라 다긴 총바체는 쪽소아 계란 택면도 사제카에 버간데스 담분에 하고 말와 게 가촌에 사제카에 버다 이시 총소아세 디나시 티진라 제바레스 디레스토라 총바체는 쪽소아 단데네마 티진데 사제카에 바 코라 리버문에도 그 쪽이세라 길 담부데 가르스나 돈이 또베 시럽다 되나 아니 자주베 데부 톱토고 마레스티 쪽이어라 돈이 또베 시럽메나 라문에 쪽에 동바티세오라 오마테조세 라문에 쪽에 동베 동이 마도나 아니 자주베 데부 톱토고 마레스 녀모바토고 마레스 자주바세데 녀모바다 시제 데벌레 자세가 나버세나 녀모텔레 자세가라 녀모바서네 자주바세 년도다 란게토서 녀모방교라 년도 자주바 란게 자주바 택매 자주바세고라 택시 자주바스도 산젤세고라 자주바니 요라 택매 자주바다 택시 자주바스 Thingme Trachumba, Thingme Jalam, Nyandu Lamla Shuni Trachumbe Drebutum, Rangeji Lamla Shuni Trachumbe Drebutum Getela, Thingme Trachumba Sura, Nyandu Trachum, Rangi Trachums, Nambelu Tekba Sumyorba, Lamia Tueg, Tarwa Toetele, Sumyore, Nyandu Tekba, Rangeji Tekba, Tejing Tebas, Nyandu de Tudujan in Yoba, Tarwa Toet Yore. Shida Keva Mamuda Tindushan, Lawa Meduge. Yon to Medusa Simshu Chadoge. Giovanni Sumzer Kale Kemne, Toyachi Shena, don't need to get a Zoli and do take was some Gora. Tele Janin Dupcha, Gavachini Kale Kapuna Kapu Tumge to Zutilla, Rangeji take was a toss Gava Sugora. And it gave a dame cousin Gorna Gorse, Tende Simshu Getel, take by Simbucho de Sugora. Or Tiduco, Trachamba, Yamo. Betrata, Shijeti Betranira, Tingmaking Yamo Betrata Pangiore, Shijeti Betrata Pangiomare, teaching Tacho Basanjegi, Yamoda, Bishipe Momba, Shitipsura, Landola Momba, Momba Sama Pangiora, all disorder. Rangune Tribe Tomba Yamatona, Trachum Bedrebutum Tugumares, Tishegora, the Tenza Keloni, Keloni Jakawa, Nesigua, the Karsuguresana. Sanje Jumde Sanderwa, Trachum Church, and then Yamsolane, Trachum Bedrebutone, and then Trachum Batelia, this is China Kelon, Tenza Kelon Yenes, then Betsawati, Kelon Trachum Batazore, Sanje Church Sonroa, and it's Chima Conju Trachum, Lam Yamsola Trachum, Sanje Sumbecato to Sutu, Sanje Sum Tambuson, Becha de Tendemedua. Ngakdola, je tingi, Shujinji tingi, Mechebanzi, tingi, top tango to assembly shada yora. And it's Chema Sanje Combato, Yangal Desade, Tasanje Karkar Sosos, and so got to a cigar. Oh, that didn't the songs again, did it. Mazushira Yimuna Yamudo, and they get out to by teaching us, Yan did the persons in Malawi, Yachi dealer, to do cut to a cigar. Oh, they cut to Zagata, and it touch about to Sanjay Tempe saw the Teresora. Tenza Kelon, Kelon Trachum Bass, de Kelon Mambuora, Megi Kelon Sarabra, Bola Kelon, Selon, Dole Kelon Salata, Dole Kelon Salata, and the Trachum Barra, young Ellen Deb Trachum Basera, Otina and Tempe saw the Kelon Trachum Bateres, and Yamo Pambe Kelon Teresera. Tenza Keloni in Azera. Keloni Jankawar Nese, or take Kelo Trachum Drebu de Toya Kaleka Pudesera, Caresina, Rangune Trube Tomba Madonna, the Rangune Trube Bayona, Yomo Pantuk Maresera. You Rangune, Yidoa, Yidomoa, Rangune Trubeta, or Tinde Samlayona, the Rangune Trubenga, Masa, Ngay Samsa, Tinde Samlayona, and Yomo Pantuk Maresera. Tomba Madonna, Yomo Pantuk, and the Trachum Mares. Then bits our Trachum Bate Mares. Tenza Keloni and a Keloni Jakawarne. Kelon Trachum Toba Kawar Nevata. And then Rangune Trubetoni Toba maybe Sirsigora. Rangune Trubetoni Madonna, and the Trachum Tugumare. Yomo Pantuk Mares. Your teacher,
Nghe câu à, né là nó câu à,
na.
câu à.
Zawa sudo shida de keche shude sigara. Zawa da yala sigara. Keche shude zawa sigara. Tempe zawa kelo trachum batere sigara. Danza kelo. Kelo la mambu yore mingi kelo sero ra. Selo ve kelo sero. Dole kelo selo da.
Anh lại đi ra trong bài vậy luôn. Yeah.
Biso.
So here then the next point turns to establishing this through like genuine reasoning, whereas before this was kind of an equivalency, saying like if you know, our scriptures are equally, your scriptures are equally contested to ours, so why accept one and not the other, and so forth. But here it gets into the actual sort of reasoning, and the first of these is that is teaching that without this wisdom realizing emptiness, it is impossible to obtain the nirvana of an arhat. So here, this comes then in the the first half of verse 44, where it says that you might insist that the root of the teachings is the monastic community, but it is implausible that those monks were arhats. So here, when it comes to this word arhat, it means like foe destroyer, and to have attained that kind of state of a foe destroyer, for that of a hearer or a or a solitary realizer, one has to have overcome the foe or the enemy of the afflictions. And to be a fully omniscient Buddha, one must also have overcome the obscurations to omniscience, those kinds of cognitive obscurations. And so here, by traversing these various paths, one is able to attain a state of liberation. Again, we talk about the various vehicles or like pathways. This is referring to the way in which we get to liberation. And so there are those hearers, Shravakas, who have sort of the lowest level of motivation, or they want to get to that state as quickly as possible. So they are only sort of have the motivation or the mental strength to say go through 2 or 3 lives. They really want to get to that kind of peace as quickly as possible. A solitary realizer has more mental fortitude to be able to pursue such a goal for many lifetimes. And then when it comes to a Mahayana, someone who is pursuing Buddhahood, the sort of incalculable amount of time, countless eons, will need to go, and they have the sort of mental fortitude to pursue that. And so here, if one has not eliminated those afflictions, those afflictive obscurations, one can't become an arhat. To be a foe destroyer, you need to have gotten rid of that. And one sort of can't get to that state of omniscience unless one removes the obscurations to omniscience. So those are the 2 sorts of foes that one is destroying. Now here, when it comes to what it is saying that the root of the teaching is the monastic community. So here the Buddha taught the Dharma, and based upon hearing that Dharma, then various beings practiced. They integrated that into their continuum, and they practiced in order to achieve those kinds of realizations, become an arhat, and so forth. And so here it is through those practitioners who were alive during the time of the Buddha. The Buddha only spoke his teachings, but there were those practitioners who had attained like the level of meditative stabilization, of non-forgetting, wherein they were able to remember the teachings of the Buddha. And later there was a compilation of those teachings. So those that like we see in the Heart Sutra and so forth, thus I have heard at one time. These sutras begin with that because it was heard by this kind of practitioner. And so it was those sort of beings who, again, were disciples of the Buddha, those monks, that then through their own practice attained the fruit of an arhat. And that is really the root of the teachings, what carries on the Buddha's teachings. And so again, if you're only going according to the sort of lesser vehicle teachings, it says it is implausible that those monks were arhats, because again, the fruit of an arhat, that state, is something that can only be attained by realizing emptiness, by seeing that the objects don't have the kind of objective existence that they appear to have. They don't have that true or inherent existence, like the I and the mind and so forth. By examining all of these things, coming to a determination that they lack that kind of objective existence is what allows one to then become an arhat. And so the root of the teachings won't come about if someone has not achieved that kind of a state, hasn't achieved that sort of liberation that is free from at least the enemy or the foe of the afflictions. So here, again, it's basically saying that without realizing the emptiness that is the emptiness of inherent existence of phenomena, it's not possible for these beings, like monastics, to become arhats, who then are the root of, who carry on the Buddha's teachings. So this is the sort of logical argument, one could say, that it's necessary to realize emptiness, even for the kind of a state of an arhat, of a hearer or a solitary realizer.
cái này tốt cái này xấu thì chị sẽ không có đoạn được phiền não nó từ đó nó phải khởi sinh từ chấp thật, cho nên từ đó mới tham sân khởi lên. Và nếu như mà không chứng được tánh không thì không chứng được bất kỳ một cái quả bồ đề nào, dù là bồ đề của hàng thanh văn hay bồ đề của hàng độc giác hay là bồ đề Phật quả. Nên
뭐야? 니장 까버네스 짱세스도와 어디 가르쳐 버렸으나 랑윈의 주베 동베 동이 똑바 매나 아니 산제지 고와 메토바 마세 녀라 다준베 고와 짱 톡톡 마레스 토야 깔라카고레스 거라 짱더데 동반이다 랑윈의 주베 동반이 똑바다 제나 산제지 고와 톡 메토바 마세 녀라 다준베 따부야 톡톡 마레스 어디세 짱세도 된다.
and trong
So here, this doesn't quite come out in this translation, but it's in the Tibetan. There's this like also sort of word, and so that it would be implausible, or it would also be implausible that those monks were arhats. So here, this is it's a little bit difficult with the translation, but and saying that not only do hearer and solitary realizer arhats need to realize emptiness, but also those who are striving for liberation, for Buddhahood, also need that. So it's necessary for both. That's kind of the meaning of that here, and it doesn't quite come out in this particular translation.
Madonna, Sembrangwine Trube Mikbata Cheba, Rangwine Trube Zimba de Dayana Sora, Rangwine Trube Mikbata Chebe Symbionani, and then young in there, but the Toya Kalaka would talk to Marit, and then Yaran Trachum Batazuga, and a young Ellie Deba Toba Kawaii, but to talk to Marisera. Karis ne Kondusim, Rangwine Trube Mikbata Cheba, Rangwine Trube Tomba Toyo Mara, Rangwine Trube. Trubal make by any Rangwine Truban Zimba Yodes, Kionani Taba to Maresodo. Simne Mida Chenam Jin Yang and Deba Cowardness. Yarat Tigi Kasura, Mumbane Shebe, Nyandu the Ranger Tachum Batasu Chichen Sigora. Mumba said the Tanda Teshimbetos Chudu Tone, Lamcom the Tachum Bedrabuto Chora, or the Chumubane Shebe Sigora. Mumbane Shebe Tachum Batazobe. Mumbane Shebe Tarki Yamo, Ranger to be Chavi to Truban Zimbatazo Payo, the Rangwine Truban Zimba de Payo Mari, Tita, Tachum Bedrebo Maresigo.
Ngoma đi là ngoma kuntu ta ngoma tổ.
Kare?
Ngoma đi ngoma tổ rồi. Lebe thấp mấy cái dễ về ngoma đi gì nào?
Ngoma sao giao chứ?
Cái ngoma cái thấp về cái trachamba đó. Ngoma đi là nó lebe cái thấp mấy cái dễ về ngoma tổ gì nào?
Giao chứ có sao cái đó xin.
Yên số rồi ba chia rồi chứ.
À, su cái cái đấy.
À, ngoma để xí về.
À, ngoma để xí, chưa ngoma chưa rồi đó.
Giờ đi.
Chưa ngoma chưa, thì thêm mấy cái xí rồi đó. Chưa ngoma chưa cái nào rồi đó. Ngoma để xí về trái chung bớt rồi đó. Chưa ngoma chưa cấp số, cái sinh hoạt cho 대신 메타 주도 시행 봐. 대신 메타 주도 나네 다음에 봐서 돼. 랑게 토베 자유지 다음에 봐서 거라. 뒤도 요아데 동반이도 또 요마라. 그래서 단디 엄마 tenjo나 시전에 뭐만 셔봐. 나 생기 자좀부터 좀 오늘 자좀부터 말해서 거라. 그래서는 랑원에 두번 집에 랑원에 두번 미페 텐지데 빠요 말해서 거라.
Thì ngoma tổ đi là này tổ rắn gì nè, vậy nó bác bà thấp mấy cái dễ về ngoma tổ sợ.
도날도 송요라 손에 강가 이 주바 마부 송비라 너무 담에 타라 마부 송요라 저날 송야 된 도날 송야 돼 랑게 투베 차이지 담에 송요라 랑문에 투베 동바티 송비오 마라 티징이 도 셰징이 도 갑수티 랑문에 투베 동바 셰고라
nên Trên đại thừa
So
nói
here then it continues by saying that for those whose minds are subject to grasping or are subject to still having the sort of object of things as being existent from their own side, objectively existent, so long as they are subject to that kind of grasping and having those objects, then nirvana is implausible or it's quite difficult. So here it's basically asserting that hearer and solitary realizer arhats, or it would be difficult for them to be able to attain nirvana, because even though these hearer and solitary realizer arhats have realized this sort of selflessness that is one of the 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths, so we often explain this as that which is explained within the Abhidharma. So here, that kind of level of selflessness is a more coarse level of selflessness, of
Santi Kebakajis no Gambana Shebe Trachumba Mai Senada Mandirese. Geniti Guatabarese Gora. And the one is an anitico Trachumba in it, Tony Togora. Ramuni to be Tomba Togora, Tebachambana Shichena. Sheshin in Dirk of Sumbana Shichena. Trachumba Ramuni to be Tomba Togora. Tommy Maru with the Ramuni to Wanzimazibal Shagra. Ranget to be Sayu to Tubanzimati, Tanzi Rakwarava. Tamu de Songi or Mari, Timen Dirk of Standa. This way.
So here, I'll try to get all of this in. Sometimes I don't get the chance. So here, if one has only realized the kind of selflessness that is a more coarse level of selflessness, as explained in the Abhidharma. So when we hear the 16 characteristics of the Four Noble Truths as explained in the Abhidharma, this is referring to the level of a realization of selflessness as the person's lacking a self-sufficient, substantially existent entity. This is a more coarse form. So to assert that someone who has only abandoned that is an arhat is incorrect, because although there will not be the kind of afflictions that arise from grasping at things as having a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, they will still have the kind of afflictions that arise from grasping onto objective existence, because this kind of level of emptiness is not explained within those Abhidharma texts. So an arhat, as is asserted by those lower schools, has only realized that sort of coarse level. This is not meant to be a derogatory thing. It's just supposed to reflect reality. The fact is that, again, although this level of emptiness is not explained within the Hinayana scriptures, it is within the Mahayana. And so it's necessary for even those who are pursuing their own liberation to realize this subtle level of grasping onto things as having objective existence in the way that we all do. That's the kind of thing that needs to be eliminated in order for one to become an arhat. Just eliminating the kind of grasping at the self as being self-sufficient and substantially existent, that realization alone is not sufficient to eliminate all of our suffering, to eliminate and attain the state of an arhat. And so here, this kind of just elimination of the coarse level of grasping at a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, as explained within the Abhidharma, is not going to lead to nirvana and is not going to lead to that state of liberation. So this is the assertion of the Madhyamaka.
Tension Draper Joa Sonza, Tension Draper Joa, Dakshita, Roa, Doxila Tension, Del Dane Church Shawers, Thabkhe Wang Shawers, Tanya Wang Shawers, could have been YouTube to run with the tuba to Yamares Shadwa. So Tombani de Umazawa Shirab Tantazuka Siriba Mabu to Yora. The Tomba Rawini to the Tomba to Trupsona. Ramani to be Tomba the nation when they read the order. I did that Sanjay Shishing Dirk somebody one to Sara. Tineta teaching the Sanjay Kamaina, Sanjay Sonshabala Hagwachi. Shishing Dirk of Shangi the Suna Tigane, Sanjay Sobala Hagwachi, Nelu Tabduchi Shangi Chadora. Ramani to be Tombati, rangye tu be chaye ju tongpa le chawa rwa ti rikbe trup tu yo ra o tawa na shi simje tamje mar kyo ba na shi Thabkhe shen chi ba se tu zu kyo thongma yo na kyo thongma me ba ne na simje tamje pa da ma da nye da ni tu di gyur di ma ju se me ba tu trup tu ra o ti ndi ko rikbe trup yo ra ndi na ma rikbe go ne trup na ne ti rangwe trupe tongpa de trup tu na ngoi ne su liya ti ne lu ke le chawa re so ra rangye trupe tsayo le chawa re so ra o ti ne sanje sumpa na shi me na sanje sumpa tu pa chi chawa chi shir chen chen de kap su sung yo re ti tsamba po de suyi na ti sanje le lawa re chung so ra ya dan de ri o ti chung shen ne de ri
So here, if we investigate and see that really this presentation of dependent origination, that things are sort of empty, they don't have this objective existence because they are dependently originated, dependent upon causes and conditions, the whole upon the parts and so forth. The thing designated is dependent upon its basis of designation. So this is, we can establish this, like as we see presented in, say, root wisdom, all of the various like logic and reasonings that are presented there, we can establish that this is the actual way that things are. This is the reality of things. And so if it were the case that this kind of presentation, as it occurs within the Mahayana, were not the speech of the Buddha, then one would have to think that, well, there is someone who has taught something that is more subtle than the Buddha, because those teachings that were, again, widely sort of propagated, that teach this level of selflessness, of the lacking a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, when we really investigate and use our logic and reasoning, we can find this more subtle understanding that this is something that kind of other level is more coarse. And so too, when it comes to things like establishing all beings as having been our mothers, if we really go through the logic of, well, if we've had countless rebirths, then that means that we have had countless different relationships with all of these beings, and therefore there's no way to deny that all sentient beings have acted as our mother and so forth. So these are things that are established by reasonings, and it is this reasoning that comes to understand this kind of reality that is more subtle than the level of selflessness as it is presented in the 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths within the Abhidharma, that kind of absence of a self that is self-sufficient and substantially existent. Again, if that were something that were the final teaching of the Buddha, and then there were something more subtle, we would have to say, well, there's a teacher that has come to an understanding more subtle than the Buddha. But that is not the case. Really, we can establish by using our faculty of reasoning that this kind of understanding of reality as it is presented in the sutras on the perfection of wisdom is the way that things are. It is the more subtle kind of understanding that the Buddha presented maybe to fewer disciples, but it accords with reality. So we will stop there for now.
Brothers and sisters, our class is going to stop here for tonight. Next week on Monday and Tuesday, His Holiness will give 2 days of teachings in the mornings for Tibetan youth at the main Tibetan temple. So Geshe-ma is going to be busy translating for His Holiness on those 2 days. So we're not going to have class on Tuesday. So the class on Tuesday will be canceled. So our next class will be Wednesday night, 7:30 to 9 p.m. as usual. Kính thưa quý vị đạo hữu, tuần tới là thứ hai và thứ ba thì Thánh Đức Đạt Lai Ma sẽ có 2 ngày thuyết giảng cho giới trẻ ở Tibetan. Cho nên giới trẻ Tibetan ở cái ngôi chùa của ngài ở Dharamsala, cho nên là sư cô sẽ không có thời gian để mà thông dịch cho cái lớp của ngài Pandita, cho nên tối thứ ba cái lớp của chúng ta tối thứ ba sẽ được hủy hoặc là rời qua một ngày khác. Nhưng mà cho nên cái lớp mà kế tiếp của chúng ta là tối thứ tư 7:30 cho đến 9 giờ tối. And so for the classes after that, we need to decide, because Thursday evening, Ms.Katrina Brooks is not going to be available. So we have to decide on what we're going to do on Thursday evening. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Galarimaji will come back on Wednesday, so we'll decide. We'll determine what we're going to do on Thursday evening. So let's now recite the short mandala offering and dedicate our meditations, our merits together. One time in English, one time in Vietnamese, and the third time in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Mặt đất này được trang nghiêm với dầu thơm và trải đầy hoa. Tô điểm với núi Tu Di, tứ đại bộ châu, mặt trời và mặt trăng. Con tưởng tượng nơi đây là cõi Phật và xin cúng dường. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh được an hưởng cõi tịnh độ này. Sa di phô kê trước sinh mê Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Nhờ nương công đức các thiện hạnh này, nguyện con sớm thành tựu quả vị của Đức Phật Bổn Sư và dẫn dắt tất cả chúng sinh không chừa sót một ai vào quả vị giác ngộ. Ge wa di nu du da la ma sa ge du ju ne ro chi kya ban de sa la ko ba so. May the supreme jewel Bodhisattva that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminished but increase more and more. Nguyện chân ngọc quý tối cao Bồ Đề Tâm, nơi nào chưa phát triển sẽ nảy sinh lớn mạnh, nơi nào đã phát triển sẽ tăng trưởng không giảm mà tăng thêm mãi mãi. Chẳng chụp xem châu Rinpoche ma ke pa nam ke kyu ching ke pa nam pa me pa yang con ne con du May we dedicate these merits to all Mother Sentient beings, including ourselves and all others. May we all complete the Buddha path and attain the Buddhahood. Nguyện đem công đức này hướng về khắp tất cả đệ tử và chúng sinh đều chốn thành Phật đạo. Thank you, Pandita. Thank you, Geshe-ma. Thank you, Geshe-ma. Thank you, Ms.Katrina Brooks. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Everybody, thank you.